which leaves us with 2 more weeks after this. We've had classes so far on evidence of Hashem's existence, which helped us bring evidence to prove HaKadosh Baruch Hu to others. We've had classes on Torah Shebechsav, the national revelation, the Maimon Har Sinai. And today's class, one of the most important classes of the entire session, focus will be on Torah Shebal Peh, the oral law. Understanding the truth of the oral law, being able to make strong arguments to others about the truth of Torah Shebal Peh. And we have tonight a speaker who's a noted scholar, a Talmud Chacham. He's had a great experience being the Rav of a shul for many years, as well as being a Rav in many of the yeshivas, such as Mevaseret and others over the years. Very knowledgeable, lots of experience. Let's give our undivided attention to a family friend and a true Talmud Chacham, Rav David Lichtman.
Shalom. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, it's my pleasure to share a little bit of time and insight with you this evening. My voice is a little bit on the much used end, so I pray that it'll survive the next hour and some minutes before its batteries run out. Wow, it's great to see such a nice crowd, healthy crowd, wide spectrum, and I hope that you're going to enjoy what we're going to be learning about tonight. For many of you, I'm assuming that you probably have never approached the concept of Torah Shebal Peh in this way. For many of you who are in your first years of learning after high school, I would imagine that many of the questions that we're going to be raising tonight are questions that you've had yourself as you're maturing and you're learning the Gemara, and you're wondering about concepts such as machlokas and etc., etc. We're not going to be addressing all of those to the Omek this evening, but we will be touching on some of them. And I'm hoping that you're going to go away a little bit enriched and with some understanding that you can share with others that will help them in their journeys. The discussion that we're going to have tonight is going to be very detailed. There's going to be a lot of information, and we need to move fast. Typically, to do this topic proper justice with the entire scope of the discussion in a frontal just lecture takes about somewhere between 2.5 to 3 hours, which we don't have. So I'm going to try to hit the major points that we have, and at the same time, I would like, if at all possible, for there to be questions and answers, because I'm sure you're going to be filled with them. I'm hoping there'll be more answers coming from me during the discussion that will, deal with your whatever issues come to your mind, so that there'll be less questions, but I think it would be worthwhile if we have questions. We're therefore going to leave the questions for the end. Hopefully there'll be time. I encourage you to please, any questions that you have, please write them down, and so we can deal with them at the end of the class. If in the event that there is something that I've said that you're not clear about, it doesn't mean that in other words, if you have a tangent about that issue or something, that's for later. But if there's something that wasn't clear to you and it's very difficult for you to proceed in understanding the discussion, try to raise your hand. I might actually say, okay, let's take this and try to clear up the issue. We're going to be addressing a very foundational question with regard to Torah Shebal Peh, which has many, many corollaries. You see, when it comes to Torah Shebal Peh, there is one, of course, when it comes to the person who's not oriented, someone who doesn't come from a Torah background, and he's introduced to the concept that, well, we have a written Torah and we have an oral Torah. And this oral Torah has an enormous amount of information to it. It actually dwarfs the written Torah. And therefore, the person will look at this enormous amount of information and say, that's how do you do this all orally? And so the first question a person is going to ask is going to be usually, how do you successfully transmit such an enormous amount of information. And if we were to play the game of broken telephone, I don't know how many gentlemen we have in the room here, maybe 40. We have 40 fellows in the room, and let's say we were to start with a simple poem that had 20 words in it. Just a simple poem that had 20 words in it. And we start with this gentleman here. He begins the poem and he gives it over one by one by one. We go through the room, and maybe it's going to take an hour, who knows, how much time it's going to take, till we go through the room, till we get back to this gentleman over here. What are the chances that you, sir, what's your name, please? Ellie, what are the chances that you will receive the 20-word poem that this gentleman, what's your name, please? What? Zav started with. What is the chances that you will receive all 20 words in the original order that you got? 10%. 10%. Anybody for higher or lower percentages? Usually someone would say it's approaching nil, the possibility. And that's part of the game, that's part of the fun of broken telephone, no doubt about it. But when we're talking about transmitting the Torah Shabbal Peh, which has millions of, shall we use contemporary language, bits of information that's being transmitted over thousands of years via thousands, millions of people for that matter, how can we possibly expect to get it correct? And if in fact Torah is our most precious possession, and not only do we need to transmit the Torah Shabbat with integrity, we also need to transmit the Torah Shabbal Peh with integrity. How, if it's Shabbal Peh, do we expect to be able to succeed to do so? It's fraught with the potential for mistakes, for confusion, for conflicts, for forgetfulness. And so it seems like the mechanism of just making it oral is fraught with disaster before it even begins. V'haraya. Let's open up the Babylonian Talmud. We look at the Talmud Bavli. How many dapim are there in the Talmud Bavli? There are some 2,500 dapim, maybe a little bit more, 2,700. And on every page, on every daf in Shas, there are probably an average of 3 machlokos, 3 disputes. Now, just do the multiplication by yourself. We're approaching some 10,000 machlokos in halacha. Does not the fact that there are so many machlokas in halacha, what is a machlokas? Is not a machlokas an indication that there's a suffix as to what the initial halacha was that was transmitted from Sinai? And if in fact there's a suffix, if we have 10,000 sfeikos, then in fact the Torah Shabbal Peh that we have today is clear prima facie evidence that we are hemorrhaging the integrity of the Torah Shabbal Peh. And so that's the first essential question, and maybe the primary question. That's the real issue we're going to be dealing with tonight. Another very interesting question people might ask is, well, if it's all written down now, then why in fact is it oral? Why in fact is it oral? Why do you call it oral? Why do you call it the oral Torah if it's been written down? Interesting. Someone asked the Kotzker Rebbe this question, and the Kotzker Rebbe took him into the Beis Medrash. Let's assume it was the Mir Merkazi, I don't know, Beis Shalom. Hundreds of guys sitting and learning. Brings him into the main Beis Medrash, goes right into the middle of the room, and tells the man, close your eyes. What do you hear? That's Torah Shabbal Peh. No matter how much Torah Shabbal Peh will ever be written down, it's always going to be discussed. It's always going to be learned. As a matter of fact, Rabbi Yehuda Anasi v'Chaverav, when they wrote down or formatted the Mishnah, it was specifically formatted in such a way so as to minimize the writing in order to maximize the discussion. So it was to stay oral. That's a side point. In order to get into our discussion, one of the things that we need to begin to address is why would we even need a Torah Shabbal Peh? Why not put everything in writing? As a matter of fact, there's a Gemara in Yerushalmi in Sanhedrin which asks exactly that question. Moshe Rabbeinu was up in Shamayim getting the Torah, and Moshe says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, "No, why don't you just give the Shulchan Aruch already?" That's exactly what the Gemara says. Just give the Shulchan Aruch. I'm not going to tell you HaKadosh Baruch Hu's answer just yet, maybe in about a half hour's time. However, do understand this question is a really fascinating question. It's so fascinating, it's so important. Moshe Rabbeinu asked the Ribbono Shel Olam this question on Har Sinai as he was getting the Torah. Why leave the Torah open for discussion? Chad v'chalak, give me a psak. Come on, Rabbi, all I want to know is what I'm supposed to do. Right? And therefore, this whole oral business seems to be unnecessary. It's sloppy. It creates confusion, let alone conflict. And so it really begs the question, why therefore should the Torah have an oral aspect? In fact, many people actually would be surprised to learn, there's a Gemara about this in Gittin, that says which is the essential Torah. Is the essential Torah the Torah Shebechtav, or is the essential Torah the Torah Sheba'al Peh? It's a fascinating question. Who would think that I would think one is more essential than the other? Would it not be correct to actually say that they are two co-complementary components? One without the other is impossible. And that's true. They are two co-complementary components, and one without the other is impossible. As a matter of fact, the Torah Shebechtav without a Torah Sheba'al Peh is impossible to live by. In and of itself, the Torah Shebechtav is a document. Without the Torah Sheba'al Peh, it's just a document. It's a document, lahavdil, in which there is no possibility to live a normal, shall we say, regulated life of a community or a nation. It's impossible. There aren't enough details. A person is chayav misa for Chilul Shabbos, Rachmana litzlan. Right? What does it say in the Torah? Don't do malacha. Malacha? What's a malacha? Well, he says this and he says that, and we have a wide-ranging conversation and conflict about what exactly is a malacha. In the meantime, a person's life is hanging in the balance, and we don't know what a malacha is. This is such as the life as the Karayim used to have. The Karayim had a really serious problem. What exactly is a malacha, for which a person is chayav misa? So, in and of itself and independently, the Torah Shebechtav can stand by itself. And of course, Torah Shebechtav, without being able to reference Torah Sheba'al Peh, without being able to reference the Torah Shebechtav, also doesn't have legs to stand on. But yet, the Maharal, in the Be'er Agola, gives a fascinating reason for why there's a Torah Sheba'al Peh. And in fact, based on the Gemara in Gittin, this Gemara in Gittin, Daf Samach, which has this discussion, which is the essential Torah? Is it the Torah Sheba'al Peh or the Torah Shebechtav? And the Gemara seems to come to the conclusion, which most Rishonim support, that in fact it is the Torah Sheba'al Peh which is the essential Torah. It is the Torah Sheba'al Peh that is the essential Torah, and in fact, if you look at the Aseres HaDibros, Parshas Yisro, right, was last week, this week, according to the Ramban, if you learn Pshat according to the Ramban, not according to Rashi, you learn according to the Ramban, the Ma'amad Har Sinai only finished in Parshas Mishpatim. Just this Shabbos in the seventh Aliyah, that was the conclusion of the Ma'amad Har Sinai, which included Parshas Shmos. If you haven't learned the Ramban yet, learn it. It's fascinating. Fascinating machlokas between Rashi and the Ramban about Ein Mukdam U'Muchar B'Torah. And if you haven't learned about it, I encourage you. It is a fascinating machlokas. Nonetheless, the Aseres HaDibros are called what? The Aseres HaDibros. Only after HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke the Dibros, then Moshe Rabbeinu goes up to Shamayim and he receives the Luchos in writing. Everything when it comes to Torah is first Ba'al Peh, and only afterwards is put down into writing. Comes the Maharal Miprag and explains in the Be'er Agola and in other places as well that in fact the Torah its very nature needs to be Ba'al Peh. Ba'al Peh, in fact, is the closest aspect that we have of unlimited discussion. What does that mean? The Ribbono Shel Olam's message is not only eternal, but the Ribbono Shel Olam's message is, like he himself is, infinite. And there's no amount of there's no amount of ink or paper that can contain the Ribbono Shel Olam's message. And therefore, the essential Torah is Ba'al Peh. What, therefore, then, can we say is the Torah Shebechtav? Says the Medrash, get ready for this, the Medrash says that what is the Torah Shebechtav? The Torah Shebechtav are the notes on the lecture. The Torah Sheba'al Peh is the lecture, and the Torah Shebechtav are the notes on the lecture. These are in various midrashim throughout Chazal, and Rav Shamshon Farrell Hirsch most contemporarily gave brought this analogy home beautifully in his Perush on Yesaris Adibros, which was in the Parsha 2 weeks ago, in which he says if you sit down in a lecture, and the lecturer gives a lecture for an hour, how many words does he speak? Maybe 10,000. How many words can you actually write down in an hour? Maybe 1,000 if you're really good. You can't possibly write down everything. But there is a methodology, and that methodology is called what? That methodology is called court stenography, shorthand. There are various methodologies by which a person can be trained and with a skill to write down an enormous volume of oral information, of oral discussion, and to commit it into writing via symbols, and each symbol represents a phrase. And therefore a court stenographer, for example, can actually write down the proceedings of a long court discussion, and not only an hour later, not only a week later, but even decades later, and if necessary centuries later, that discussion can be recreated and regenerated with 95% accuracy based on the court stenographer's notes. That's amazing. It can be done. And that exactly is what the Torah Shebechtav is to the Torah Sheba'al Peh, according to almost all the Mefarshim. It's rather fascinating. And that's a fascinating perspective, because most people have the understanding that Torah Sheba'al Peh is the explanation of the Torah Shebechtav. It is the Perush, it is the commentary on the Torah Shebechtav. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Now, that we need a lot, that discussion in and of itself requires a lot of elaboration, but I think some of you are getting the notion here because of your experience in learning Gemara, and you're nodding your heads. Yeah, right, that makes sense. Okay, but perhaps with another opportunity we can elaborate just on that one point alone. Every point that we make here can be a class in and of itself, a discussion in and of itself. Let's move on. There is a medrash, the Pesita Zutra, which actually brings down a fascinating concept in the relationship between Torah Shebechtav and Torah Sheba'al Peh. And when I first saw this, I was about your age when I first saw this Pesita Zutra, and I was amazed. I'll share it with you. The medrash there, it's actually a brisa. A brisa says, what exactly is the relationship between Torah Shebechtav and Torah Sheba'al Peh? Well, it is Mashal Amad Averdoma to a melech that had two sons. One was the Bechor, and the second son, he was swift. He was fast. And the king didn't know which one should I give the melucha to. Which one will be the king after me, inherit the throne. And so he gave them a test, and he brought them into a room. And in the room, there were two tables. And on each table, there were identical food stuffs and ingredients. There were eggs and milk and salt and sugar and flour and meats, poultries, you name it. All the raw ingredients were there for whatever it is that your culinary arts and skills could desire. And there were two tables with the identical foodstuffs on them, and he said, I'm going to come back in 3 days, and I want to see how, what you've done here. And so he comes back in 3 days, and the Bechor says, okay, my father, my king, right? Come, and I will... Did you guys get that? That's fine. No? What decade are you guys living in? My father, my king. My kids sing that, and they're Israelis. I mean, what? Right? Okay. So, it's Tati. It's Tati, my king? Okay. I'm the one that's added it. Okay. My kids didn't teach me well enough. And therefore, he says, okay, Tati, my king. He comes and he shows him. They go into an elevator and go deep down under the dungeons of the palace into a massive refrigerator room and a freezer room. There it is, the table that he gave him, bedecked with all the raw ingredients that he originally had, the eggs and the salt and the sugar and the poultry and all that stuff. It's all there, well preserved. The king said, excellent, my son. What about you, number two? So number two, they go up in the elevator and they go into the banquet hall. And in the banquet hall, there are numerous tables bedecked with all the delicacies, well-prepared foods, whether they are entrees or whether they're the entrees and sides and desserts, etc., etc. Everything is made to perfection, absolute perfection. king, of course, awards the crown to the second son. But that's not the point of the Medrash. The point of the Medrash, or the Brisa rather, is to say that that's the relationship between the Torah Shabbat and the Torah Shabbat. The Torah Shabbat is merely the raw ingredients. You don't eat raw ingredients. That's the point we were trying to say before. The Torah Shabbat, Torah Shabbat is where we process those raw ingredients to perfection. What does that mean to perfection? To the point where we can live it. We can live it. It's functional. We can integrate it into our lives and live our lives according to it in a smooth fashion. That's a fascinating brisa describing the relationship between Torah Shabbat and Torah Shabbat. Now, having said that, what we're going to do now is actually have a brief discussion about this relationship that we described before in terms of the relationship that Rav Shmuel Hirsch was echoing from the Midrashim about the notes on the lecture. And this I think, is an important point. Excuse me. In order to explain this, basically it's as follows. Now, at the risk of bringing up very painful memories from high school, many of you would probably remember, even though you don't care to remember, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, right? I'm hearing some exasperating sighs, right, coming from the room. And yes, it's a surprise quiz right now. That was really painful, right? Okay. So let's just take a simple, want to throw out any equations, known equations that we have from algebra? Quadratic. Okay, it's been for me about 50 years since. So you want to just tell me, what is it?
Negative b plus or minus the square root.
Wait a second. Negative b plus or minus
the square root b squared minus 4ac.
Wow.
The square root 2a.
Over 2a?
The whole thing over 2a, the square root encompasses the 4ac as well. There we go.
Are we okay? Hey guys, it's just an approximation, okay? I didn't remember this. I remember there was such a thing called a quadratic equation, but honestly, yeah, it's coming back to me. Now I'm having the pains, okay? In any event, whether this is accurate or not, but what's the point of this equation? This equation has givens and has variables. Every single equation that you learned in algebra, in geometry, in trigonometry, all had givens and variables. Am I correct? Are we all on the same page? Givens and variables? Given that there were always givens and variables, we are now going to learn how the Torah Shabbat serves as the notes for the lecture on Torah Shabbat Pet. There's a Gemara in Tzmura, fascinating Gemara in Tzmura, that actually brings out the horror of the initial question that we posed in this evening's discussion. If it's oral, it's definitely going to be suspect to confusion, being conflicted, being forgotten. And so says the Gemara, brings down Ma'aser Shahaya. B'yemei avelo shel Moshe Rabbeinu. In the days of the Moshe Rabbeinu's Shiva, how long was Moshe Rabbeinu's Shiva? 7 days, correct? Incorrect. Sorry. Thank you for playing. We have a wonderful consolation prize to you backstage. Next contestant, please.
A month.
It was 30 days. The Shiva was 30 days, right? I used to be a pulpit rabbi. Anybody here from Canada? Anybody from Western Canada? No? Okay. I used to live in, I was a rabbi in Calgary, Canada. Way out. Beautiful, gorgeous place. Gorgeous. And one time, so, the community was made of a mixture of all types of people, and the lady was sitting Shiva. She says, Rabbi, I'm only going to sit Shiva for 3 days. So I said, well, that's very nice. You can do what you want to do, but just to be clear, Shiva means 7. So when I ask how long was Moshe Rabbeinu's Shiva, it should be a clear giveaway because it's 7 days. But really, the entire Shiva, conceptual Shiva, period, extended over 30 days. And during that 30-day period, Yoshua ben Nun forgot hundreds of halachos that Moshe Rabbeinu taught him. The Gemara says that it was an issue of midos. That's why Yoshua forgot things. That's not our point of our discussion. And when it became known amongst the Machaneh that Yoshua ben Nun, who was charged with being the individual, he was the repository of Torah Shebaal Peh, he was the bearer of the torch of Torah Shebaal Peh. When it became known that he had forgotten hundreds of halachos, what was the response of the Eidah of the Machaneh, everyone? They wanted to stone him to death. It's a Gemara in Tzimura. They were going to stone him to death until Ahmad Osniel ben Kenaz, who's Yeshua's brother-in-law, unless I'm mistaken, and Ve'echziram al Yidei Pilpulo. And he used pilpul, not the pilpul of bris, not that. He used pilpul to reconstruct the halachos of the Torah Shebaal Peh that Yoshua ben Nun had forgotten. So what is it that we're referring to? We're referring to the 13 midos Sha'Torah Nidreshes Ben. Not the Shlosh Esrei midos of Rachamim, but Rabbi Shmuel Omer, the Shlosh Esrei midos HaTorah Nidreshes. Kal B'chomer Gzer Shava, etc., etc., etc. And there are many others like those 13. That's not our discussion this evening. Nonetheless, these 13 midos were used by Osniel ben Kenaz to reconstruct the halachos that Yoshua ben Nun had forgotten. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Mefurish Gemara. How does it work? Well, we have a midah. And we crank the midah through a pasuk. And the result is halacha. Basically, there are givens and there are variables. It's a mathematical equation in a linguistic form. Kal v'chomer, gzer shava, etc., etc. These are formulae through which I can, someone who has smicha, not the smicha of today, but the smicha in the time of the Sanhedrin. If you had smicha in the time of the Sanhedrin, that means that you were trained, tested, and licensed in the use of the midos Sha'Torah Nidreshes Ben. That means that you knew how, if a halachic situation came up, you knew how to choose a pasuk, or a phrase in a pasuk, or a word in a pasuk, or a letter in a pasuk, and you knew how to choose a midah, pair them together, and generate a halacha, or regenerate a halacha that had become confused, conflicted, or forgotten. So here we have a very, very clear way of understanding the relationship between Torah Shebechtav and Torah Shebaal Peh, in which the Torah Shebechtav are the notes from which we can reconstruct, if necessary, the lecture, which is the Torah Shebaal Peh. And so, my friends, what we've done now is to come a little bit of full circle in terms of understanding the concept of the need for a Torah Shebaal Peh and the relationship between the Torah Shebechtav and the Torah Shebaal Peh for the purposes of our discussion, which we're going to get into right now. You see, what we're going to do now is to have a brief discussion outlining that when we say Torah Shebaal Peh for the rest of the discussion this evening, right? It is now about 12 minutes to 10. For the balance of the evening, when we say Torah Shebaal Peh, I'd like us to specify what exactly do we mean. Let me explain why I say that. When we say Torah Shebaal Peh, well, we have to be clear that Torah Shebaal Peh actually contains two dimensions to it. One dimension is what's called Agadata, and the other one is called Shmaitza. Shmaitza is otherwise known as Halacha. And so what we're going to be referring to Torah Shebaal Peh for the purposes of our discussion this evening, we're referring to Shmaitza, to Halacha. And when we talk about Halacha in the Torah Shebaal Peh, there are actually two dimensions. There are two aspects, two areas that we can break it down further. Of course, those would be what? Doraisa and Durabanan. And so for the purposes of our discussion, we're going to be speaking specifically about Doraisa. Now you might ask, why Doraisa? Why not limit it? Why not open it up to Durabanan as well? The answer is actually very interesting and very clear at the same time. You see, the balance of our discussion this evening is going to be based on the title of the class, which was there a title for the class?
Oral law.
Just oral law? Oh, never mind. Okay. Usually, what is it? Bringing evidence for the accuracy of the oral law. Okay, that's important. Okay, when we say bringing evidence for the accuracy of the oral law, what we mean is, can we bring validation? Can we authenticate that the Torah Sheba'al Peh that we were given originally at Sinai, that we claim we were given at Sinai, can we validate that in fact it was transmitted to us with integrity in such a manner that it was not corrupted along the way? That's the question at large. So when we're saying what came from Sinai, we're talking about Torah Sheba'al Peh that was given to Moshe Rabbeinu. And that would be referring to Doraisa, Durabanan. Sure, there's plenty of Durabanan. And there's an overwhelming amount of information about Torah Sheba'al Peh that is Durabanan in Shas. But that's not our discussion this evening. Because that's not the essence of the question. Whether that was transmitted with integrity. That has its own dimension. Was it transmitted with integrity? But it can't hold a candle to the intensity of the question about Doraisa information that was transmitted. So hence we're going to be focusing on the Doraisa. Now, within Doraisa, they're actually, therefore, it's important that we realize that we're referring to halacha that is Doraisa. So far, so good? Very straightforward. No serious calisthenics over here. Okay. I think it's important, before we get into the type of discussion about evaluating evidence, bringing up evidence and evaluating it, to discuss the integrity of the transmission. We touched on the point that in Torah Sheba'al Peh, there is prima facie evidence, not just prima facie evidence, it is filled with machlokas. And so it behooves us to spend just a few moments to speak about how did machlokas actually come into the picture. Okay? Now, I don't know how many of you learned about machlokas in your years so far. You've learned machlokas every day. That's the heart of learning Gemara. And I mean that in many ways, which you're going to find out in a moment. But why did machlokas become a reality? Why did machlokas become a reality? Well, the truth of the matter is, I would expect it to become a reality. What do you mean? It's oral. Oral means that it's going to be. Look at what happened with Yoshua ben Nun. And if he forgot, isn't it reasonable to expect Talmidim to have a conflict about what the Rebbe said? All the time. So therefore, why should it surprise us that there's machlokas? But the reality is that Shas tells us, as a Gemara, it tells us that in fact the first real machlokas actually manifested itself in Bayis Sheni period. It was about, does anybody know what the machlokas is about? It was about smicha. But not smicha, rabbinic smicha, but smicha of a korban that you bring on Yantiv. Yeah? So, in any case, without getting into the details of the machlokas, but there was a question about whether smicha, in other words, we lean our hands, actually lean our body into the korban, to do smicha, before we makriv it. I don't want to talk about which korban, whatever, it's not exactly necessary right now. Can you do smicha on Shabbos or Yantiv? The question is that maybe smicha is considered a shvus in the mikdash. Is there a shvus in the mikdash? Not a shvus in the mikdash? Whatever, that's not really essential right now. It was machlokas, which was never resolved, quite frankly. That was considered the first machlokas. You mean there was never a machlokas up until then? Well, there was machlokas all the time, quite frankly, but they were always resolved. This was the first machlokas that was not resolved. and later on Hillel and Shammai had how many machlokas between them? Do you know? 3. Hillel and Shammai just had 3 points of machlokas between them. Their Talmidim had many, had dozens. And after that, Ravta machlokas b'Yisrael, Gemara says. Why did this all happen? So let me explain a little bit deeper than what Shas actually tells us. In order to have a successful transmission of Torah Sheba'al Peh, it is of necessity that we have 2 criteria in place. The first criteria is what? That we all need to live in a close geographic proximity one to the other. That makes sense. The second criteria is that there needs to be time. There needs to be time, enough time for the Rebbe and Talmud for the information to be transmitted, for the Talmud to absorb it, and for the Rebbe to be certain that the Talmud has integrated the information and is ready to proceed. That requires close geographic proximity. It requires time and patience. Well, at the time of the rebellion of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, those 2 elements, those 2 criteria, were basically completely destroyed. The Jewish people were beginning to disperse from the land of Israel, but due to the oppressions as well, we didn't have the requisite time or peace of mind to be able to have the proper learning exchange between Rebbe and Talmud. As a result, machlokas was beginning to accrue. And it was at that time that Rabbi Yehuda v'Chaverav said, we have to do something to number 1, address machlokas, and number 2, to ensure that wherever Am Yisrael goes, because we're going in different directions right now, we all take Torah Sheba'al Peh with us, but it's all the same Torah Sheba'al Peh. Hence, the Mishnah, as we know it today, was born. The Mishnah, Shas, Mishnayos, and subsequent to that, the Gemaras, both the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Talmud Bavli, were specifically designed to accommodate and address those 2 needs. Needs number 1, wherever we go, we all have the same Torah Sheba'al Peh. And number 2, to address the issue of machlokas. And what does that mean, to address the issue of machlokas? It means we are here to identify where machlokas is and to resolve it to the greatest extent possible. That is the job of Shas, whether it's Mishnah or whether it's Gemara. That's the job. It's the overarching job. It is the number 1, maybe number 2. Some people want to argue with me. It's very, very high up there. I believe it's number 1 according to Rov Rishonim, certainly according to most Achronim that I've come across. There is no doubt that the reason why Shas was so invested, why they had to put this in the way it was formatted, was to identify where there's machlokas and to resolve it to the greatest extent possible. This, by the way, might actually help us in addressing a question that we asked earlier. Why is it that when we look at Shas, we see that Shas is replete with machlokas? We seem to be hemorrhaging, right, from Sveikos. Well, there might be a lot of Sveikos, but that's the job of Shas. The reason why you find a machlokas on every daf, on every amud of Shas, is because that's his job, to focus on the area with his machlokas. Problem is that we come away with the impression that machlokas is rampant and all over the place. We're going to come back to that point soon. Okay. Someone had a question, or do we address it? Thank you. Okay, good. So now we're going to do, having said that, we're now going to launch into the main discussion of the evening. And this is where the fun starts. If you weren't having fun up until now, brace yourselves. Okay, I hope I put down enough points. We are now going to embark on a journey. It's a journey that, excuse me, I hope you're going to enjoy. It's going to require, you have to hold cup. You've got to, pay attention closely to the details that we'll be sharing with you. We are now going to have a point-by-point discussion, which is going to identify individual aspects that address the methodology and of the integrity of the transmission of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and collectively create a very profound effect, in my opinion. Your opinion will be yours. Are you ready? Here we go. What's your name? Where are you from?
Los Angeles.
Great. What are you learning? Where are you learning?
Aish.
You're in Aish?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Pleasure to meet you. Here we go. Okay. Well, where else can we start except for broken telephone? That's how we started this evening. Let's actually bring it out. Broken telephone is going to be point number 1. Why am I bringing up broken telephone? Well, broken telephone seems to be the essential question. If we can't get a message of 20 words correct, not just the words themselves, but the order of the words in a space of an hour, transmitting it from person to person through the room, how can we expect to get millions of bits of information through thousands of years transmitted by millions of people? And I believe if we look at the issue of broken telephone, we can see that there are 3 major distinctions between Torah Shabbal Peh transmission and broken telephone. In broken telephone, each transmission has to be done in private, one-on-one. Torah Shabbal Peh, with the exception of Masa Bereshis and Masa Merkava, everything is in public. Again, go into any base medrash and try to carry on a normal conversation with somebody. But if you're learning with someone, you can. It's noisy. It's public. It's supposed to be that way. The second difference is regarding the fact that it's a secret. No, that's not it. What's the second point? You're going to tell me you're going to tell me what I'm thinking? Somebody tell me what I'm thinking, because I forgot. I feel like Yoshua ben Nun. Second point is, yes. Second point is, well, we saw one-on-one versus public, right? Repetition. You can't repeat it. There are some versions of broken telephone where you're allowed to dial 0 and you're allowed to repeat it once. But otherwise, even with that limited rule, you're not allowed to repeat it. Torah Shabbal Peh is all about repetition. It's all about repetition. The entire essence of learning Torah Shabbal Peh is repeating it. Chazara, 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 chazara. And there's a third difference between them. The third difference is that broken telephone is a game. And Torah Shabbal Peh, kihem chayenu v'orech yameinu. And without it, what do they want to do to Yoshua ben Nun? To kill him, to stone him to death. This is serious. This is our life. You're playing games with our life and forgetting halachas of Torah Shabbal Peh? How dare you? I was a Rebbe and lecturer here at Aish Torah for about 20 years. And I remember about 20 years ago, not 20 years ago, we're going back because I left here about 7 years ago, so we're going back about 25 years ago. 25 years ago, we had 3 groups from London, from England. Here, anybody from England? Okay, we had 3 groups from England. And each group was about 20 people, and maybe more, about 30 people in each group. And we were giving them a series of classes, and the next day we were going to have a Torah Shabbal class. It was a class about oral Torah. And we were having a particularly difficult time with these Brits, and we came up with an idea. Not that Brits are difficult people. And the idea was, in other words, how can we convey the concept of Torah Shabbal Peh? So what we did was, this is the time when Aish Torah once upon a time actually had money. We said, you know what? The night before the class, we're going to play broken telephone. And they were split up into the 3 groups that they came in, about 20, 30 guys in each group. And each group was given a poem. I think it was a 25-word poem. And any group that would get the poem 100% spot on, we would pay them each 50 pounds. Not dollars, pounds. In those days, pounds actually was worth a lot more than dollars. Maybe still is, I'm not sure. But we paid them 50 pounds. So what was the result? What do you think? 2 groups got it spot on. The 3rd group was off by just a few words. We paid them all. Because when it really matters to you, you work really hard. Now think about how hard you work when your life depends on it. So it's different from broken telephone in those three ways. The next point that we're going to get to is something that I like to call standardization. Did I get that right? Standardization. What do we mean by standardization? Many people also have a confusion about Torah Shabbal Peh. And they think, well, Rabbi Yishmael says what he thinks, and Rabbi Akiva says what he thinks. I'll say what I think. Why not? Well, one of the ways in which we can discuss that is by understanding that, that what we said before, that in order to get into the discussion, you have to be a professional. Like we said, Smicha in the time of the Sanhedrin meant that you were trained, tested, and licensed in the Midos HaTorah Dreshes Bed. Much the same way that a doctor is trained, tested, and licensed in medical theory and application, much the same way that an attorney is, and other professions as well. So therefore, are you in the profession to begin with? Have you been trained, tested, and licensed to engage in this professional discussion? That's one level. However, it is also important and essential to recognize that many people think that Torah Shabbal Peh is a free-for-all. It goes from father to son. And they're not to be faulted for thinking that. After all, doesn't it say in Kriya Shema, Vishinantam levanecha v'dibar tavam? Right? You tell your child. So it shouldn't be from father to son. It's true. It is from father to son. But the essential Torah Shabbal Peh, the transmission of what is Torah Shabbal Peh, was not from father to son. The essential mitzvah of transmitting the Torah Shabbal Peh was Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai Yisrael le Yoshua le Zakain lehu Zakanim le Neviim le Anshe Knesset Gedola v'chulei. All these people who were in the headlines, that their names were neon lights and Pirkei Avos over there, they were the ones who were responsible for the corpus of what we call Torah Shabbal Peh. It's not just the individuals. And so therefore there was an institution. One institution, who was responsible for defining and determining what was Torah. They were the repository of Torah. They were the arbiters of Torah. And it was their responsibility to transmit Torah from generation to generation. That was the Sanhedrin. And this Sanhedrin sat continuously, not the same people, but continuously for 1,700 years. Think, the United States Supreme Court is what, 220 some odd years? The Sanhedrin stayed in continuous session for 1,700 years, until about the 3rd century of the Common Era, the beginning of the 3rd century of the Common Era. And therefore, there was a continuous transmission of what is Torah. That's a very important point. There was a standardization. There was a standard. The institution of the Sanhedrin kept it standardized. As the Torah said, Chok echad, there was one mitzvah echad for everyone. Le'ezrach haaretz v'chulei v'chulei. Now, when we're talking about standardization, I think it's important that we address a side point right now, and I want to further address a question. What was it that was actually transmitted? Many people think that what was transmitted is every single detail in the Torah Shabbal Peh. And the fact is that is correct, but not exactly accurate. What's your name, please? Aaron is saying, okay, what do you mean? Correct? Now let me explain what I mean by that. You see, it's true that all these halachas were transmitted. But when we said earlier that, well, halachas that are being transmitted are d'oraisa, well, we need to realize that there are several different categories within a d'oraisa. One category of d'oraisa is what we know as halacha l'Moshe misinai. Another category of halacha, the Rambam calls it halacha misura misinai. And then the Rambam identifies a third category, and that's what's called halacha mechudeshes. Okay? We got to really, I'm sorry about this. It's 10 after 10. I got to put on the gas here. I'm sorry. So, what is halacha l'Moshe Misinai? Halacha l'Moshe Misinai is a halacha for which there is absolutely no hook in the Torah Shebechtav. I can't go back to the Torah Shebechtav and retrieve it, to reconstruct it, if it becomes confused, conflicted, or forgotten. If it becomes confused, conflicted, forgotten, goodbye. That halacha is out of here. We can never, ever regenerate it, reinstate it. Halacha l'Masura Misinai is exactly that. It's a halacha that in the event that we become confused, conflicted, or forgotten, we can regenerate it, like the halacha said, Yosniel ben Kenaz did to Yoshua ben Nun. The Gemara brings down by an esrog, the Gemara in Sukkah. How do we know that an esrog, that a Priyat Hadar is an esrog? And so the Gemara goes through about 2 amudim of explaining all types of drushes. How do we get from Priyat Hadar to esrog? Do we need that? No. Go to shul. You see everyone's carrying an esrog. It's a living organic halacha. But in the event that it ever can become confused, conflicted, or forgotten, we have a methodology through the Midos Torah Dreshus to retrieve and reconstruct that the halacha of Priyat Hadar means an esrog. That's the category of halacha Masur Misin, and it's an overwhelming majority of the halacha. There's a halacha Mechudeshes, which we're not going to get into, but that's a halacha that a new situation has come up, which we weren't informed about at Sinai. We have the tools to deal with it, and therefore we're going to generate a new halacha. From this, we could see that there are actually some fascinating categories, or shall we say bodies of information within Torah Sheba'al Peh. There is one body of information that is called Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, category number 1. There is another category that we're going to call the Midos Sha'Torah Dreshus Behem. It's category number 2. There is a third category. I don't know if you've ever heard of a sefer called Kesef Nivchar. It's written about 180 years ago. And it's a fascinating sefer. Go look it up. You're probably, in your learning of Gemara, you've been exposed to Klale Gemara, like Tadir V'Sheino, Tadir Kodem, things like that. That's usually a one in Kachim and in Moed. And these Klalim, there are 160 of them. Kesef is Gematria. 160, I hope. Should be 160. And Kesef Nivchar, am I right? Yeah, I got it right? Kesef Nivchar? Kesef is 160? Good. Okay. So, therefore, there are these 160 klalim which were transmitted. So if you got smicha in the time of the Sanhedrin, you, number 1, were given ba'alut, you were given responsibility for the halacha Moshe Sinai, you were given ba'alut and authority to paskin shilas using the Midos Torah Dreshus Behem, and you were taught how to use the klolei shas, the various klolim, in order to evaluate which way the halacha should go. This, my friends, is what a person who had smicha was given. True, they also received halacha Masura Misinai, but sometimes those things could be confused, conflicted, forgotten, or they could vacillate. They could turn into different halachas over time, in fact, believe it or not. But these 3 things were the main things. It's not an enormous amount of information now. Now we're not talking about millions of bits of information. We're talking about a very limited, refined a dictionary of information for which the people who were responsible to transmit Torah received themselves and transmitted over. It's a very different picture than what we thought. Okay, now we're going to go on to the third point. The third point is a really great one. I enjoy this one. I hope you will too. In order for us to be able to see the integrity of the transmission of Torah Sheba'al Peh, we're going to look at machlokas. Because machlokas is actually one of the greatest proofs that the Torah Sheba'al Peh was transmitted with integrity. You might say to me, Yosef is going to say, but Rabbi Lichtman, I don't understand. If there's machlokas in every page of Shas, and that means that we have close to 10,000 machlokas all over Shas, aren't we hemorrhaging and falling apart? Isn't that the greatest simon of Speikos, and we don't know what's going on in Torah Sheba'al Peh? Isn't that true, Rabbi Lichtman? Yosef, that's your question. Is that this question? And so what are we going to answer, Yosef? Fascinating. There was a sefer, many of you are familiar with Sefer Kuzari. Right? Most opinions was written by Rabbi Yehuda Levi. We're not sure, but Usama was written by him. Nonetheless, there's another sefer, believe it or not. It's called Sefer Kuzari Sheni, and it's written in Italy by a rabbi of David Nito. From the 1750s. And in this sefer, he said like this, the Sefer Kuzari deals primarily with Torah Shabbat and Torah Shabbal Peh in general a little bit. I'm going to deal with the details of Torah Shabbal Peh. So he has 5 very lengthy essays, not essays, but give and take between it's a made-up essay. He says it right at the beginning. He says, I'm making this up, as if it was a discussion between the Chaver, the rabbi, and the Melech HaKuzar, and about the Torah Shabbal Peh. And in his third act of the discussion, he brings up an absolutely fascinating raya for the fact that we are not hemorrhaging in the halachos of the Torah Shabbal Peh. And it's all based on the fact that there is machlokas and shas. What does he say? He said like this. The truth of the matter is, if we look at all the halachos that are doraisa, forget about the darabbanans. We're going to look at all the halachos that are doraisa in the Torah Shabbal Peh. That will say all that 100%. Okay, we've got 100% of the machloksim that we see. Of all those halachos, I'm sorry. Wait, restate. I want to restate this. When you look in Shas, especially in Mishnah and Brisa, where is there machlokas? Wherever it says, Rebbe A says X, Rebbe B says Y. But it also times when it just says the halacha X, and there's no machlokas about it. Where there's no machlokas, it's a siman that what? We're all in agreement. The question is, what percentage of halachos that are doraisa, right, out of 100% of halachos that are doraisa in Torah Shabbal Peh, what percentage do we see that there's absolute total agreement on, and what percentage do we see that there's machlokas? What a fascinating question. His answer? There is agreement in somewhere between 85 and 90% of all halachas that are doraisa. Machlokas is only between 10 and 15% of halachas. And that only verifies what we said before, that the reason why there's machlokas on every daf in Shas is because, my friends, that's the job of Shas, to identify machlokas and to work to resolve it to the greatest extent possible. That's why it's on every page, because that's its job. Why doesn't it focus on where there's no machlokas? Of course, it's in there, but there's no point to focus on it. There's no machlokas about it. You don't even notice it. You just breeze right by. Hey, you see that? Whoa, wow, Doppler effect, right? Oh, machlokas, let's focus on that. That's not juicy. What's the yesod of machlokas? But the halacha, no machlokas about it. Who's interested? Guess what? We're interested right now. It validates for us that we're not hemorrhaging halacha. It's a fascinating take on the issue of machlokas. But now we're going to go and have some fun. Everyone put on your Indiana Jones hats. We're going to go into the desert. And we're going to be looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls. You've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Back in 1947, the Bedouin shepherd boy found fragments and scrolls in caves in an area called Qumran, which is to the north of the Dead Sea. And of course, they're displayed. Most of them are not most, but some of them are displayed, or copies of them are displayed. Reliable copies are displayed in the Israel Museum. And these Megillot, these scrolls, date back to approximately 1900 years. 1900 years. Now, in order for me to tell you this discussion, to share this discussion with you, I need to share a different discussion with you first. We're going to be going back to the 1840s. And in the 1840s, there was a German Jewish scholar by the name of Abraham Graetz. G-R-A-E-T-Z. G-R-A-E-T-Z. Abraham Graetz was an individual who spent a lot of time producing materials which ultimately formed the foundation of the German Reform movement of Judaism. And one of the most powerful essays that he wrote, research topics that he wrote, had the following conclusion. And the conclusion that he came to was, he researched the concept of oral Torah. Where did it come from? And this was his conclusion. His conclusion was Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi and his colleagues completely generated and fabricated the existence of the oral Torah. It didn't exist before. They completely fabricated it, pulled the wool over everybody. So if they can do that, well, we're not really beholden to the oral Torah. They were very bright men. They were very inspired individuals. They had a lot of good content in there, but we by no means are beholden to what they said, because evidence that I have in front of me is that it was generated and fabricated. We now come to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of them date to about 1900 years. However, let's roll a little timeline. Okay, and we're going to have the year 0 over here. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi v'Chaverav were approximately 200 of the Common Era. Okay, 200 of the Common Era. However, the Dead Sea Scrolls, most Dead Sea Scrolls, will go back to around this period right over here. There's one document, and only one document to the best of my knowledge. This is irrelevant, but there could be more, but I think there's only one, that actually goes back to the middle of Bayis Sheni. It goes back to about a decade right before Hanukkah. It goes back to over here where we're talking about, I think it's 185 BCE, which means that there is a distance between this particular document and Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi of approximately 400 years. And you can see where this discussion is going. Now, this document is called the MMT. Why is it called the MMT? Well, for Miktzat Maaseh Torah. Miktzat Maaseh Torah, in which there was an actual document of a letter, of a correspondence between the scholars of Qumran, which were heretical. They were heretics. They were individuals who didn't believe in Torah Shebaal Peh, and the Rabbanim in Yerushalayim, who were the precursors of the Prushim, the precursors of what we call Chazal today, who were the bearers of Torah Shebaal Peh. And there was a document called Mitzvas Maaseh Torah, where the scholars from Qumran said, these are the Mitzvot Maaseh Torah, where you and we have a dispute about what is the oral Torah law about these issues. And the reason why we have this dispute is because we don't believe in the same Torah Shebaal Peh that you do. Be that as it may, there is a listing of some, I think it's about 130-ish halachos. And these halachos span all of Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, Kachim, Zrayim, Nashim. It's all over the place. About 130 halachos. And in many places, they say, we say X, you say Y. And very often, when they say we say X, we kind of see echoes of the Tzedukim, if you know what I'm talking about. However, and here's where things get actually fascinating. Yes, sir.
So how do we know about the accuracy of that scroll?
It is. We have it.
Oh, we just have it.
We have it. It is what it is. We know that we know where it dates to. That's what's important. For the purposes of our discussion, this is what's important, the dating of the document. Okay? Now, what's fascinating is that when they represent the the position of the rabbis in Yerushalayim, you guys, number one, the halachos that they say that the rabbis in Yerushalayim represent are exactly the same halachos that we see in the Mishnayos from the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Not only that, the Hebrew phraseology is exactly the same as in the Mishnayos. Not only 400 years before Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi do we have what? Do we have evidence of Torah Shebaal Peh halachos existing in Klal Yisrael even before Hanukkah, of halacha l'moshe we see of Torah Shebaal Peh that we see in the time of the Mishnah. We see even the same phraseology that the Mishnah used in these halachos is the same phraseology that is used in the MMT to describe those halachos. This was published by a Jesuit priest by the name of John Strugnell and an extremely, extremely left-wing Israeli scholar by the name of Elisha Qimron. He's so left-wing that he looks like a right-wing guy. That's how far left-wing he is. And so what do they write in their analysis? In their analysis, it's fascinating. They published a book, finally. It took them 30 years to publish. They published a book with a translation and critical notations on the document. And in their critical notations, they brought Greats down. And they said, you know something? Greats said that Rabbi Yehuda Anasi and his friends and his colleagues fabricated and generated the Torah Sheba'al Peh. That is patently false. The MMT document discredits Greats' research and conclusions. We now move on. We're going to go to point number 5. You guys with me? We're doing okay? Okay, let's move on to point number 5. How about it, point number 5? Okay, point number 5. Point number 5. Okay, let's have some fun. Point number 5, excuse me, is going to be Shiloh. Point number 5 is going to be Shiloh. Yeah, right. Point number 5 is going to be Shiloh. Now, Shiloh, what's fascinating about Shiloh, when I say Shiloh, what am I referring to? The Battle of Shiloh. Remember the Battle of the Civil War, right? Anybody know what I'm talking about? I don't expect you to understand. It's in America. Battle of Shiloh. But what was Shiloh? You said you're British, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Where are you from? London. Okay. Where?
East London Village. Snake over the street.
Okay. I spent some time in Edgware.
Also near Edgware.
Oh, okay. Fine. Okay, fascinating. Shiloh. Where is Shiloh? What am I referring to when I say Shiloh? Mishkan. The Mishkan Shiloh. Okay, Shiloh is about an hour's drive from Yerushalayim, just north of Yerushalayim. And if you go to Shiloh, and I strongly encourage you to go, not by yourselves, but when you go to Shiloh, that is where the Mishkan stood. Do you know for how many years? For approximately 360 years. That's a long time. The United States of America has been around for 220 some odd years. The Mishkan was in Shiloh for 360 years. What? 69? Thank you. I think it was 59. Good, I stand corrected. So let's go round it up 370 years, just for some discussion. 370 years. That's a long time. That's a long time. First, the Mishkan was where? Initially, the first time the Mishkan was around, it was in the Midbar. And then it moved to Gilgal. And then from Gilgal, it moved to Shiloh. And from Shiloh, it went to Nov. And from Nov, it moved to Gilgal. And not Gilgal, Givon. And from Givon, it moved to? It didn't move to. That was its last stop. After Givon, everyone got off, and the Beis Hamikdash was built. First Beis Hamikdash by Shlomo HaMelech. Okay. Now, that's all nice history, isn't it? I mean, do we really need to know that? Not terribly. Yeah, in order to pass the Navi exams, we have to know something about the Mishnah and where it was, which Kufa where it was, and so on and so forth. There's an interesting halacha about Yisur Bamos and Heter Bamos, which is Kudai for us to know Bisman Hazeh. But other than that, we know it's just historical. Wouldn't you know it? There is a Mishnah. There is a Mishnah in Zvachim, a fascinating Mishnah in Zvachim. There's a Mishnah in Zvachim that says like this. You know, there are two different levels of Kudshim. Korbanos and Kudshim. You've heard of this, correct? There's something that's called Kudshe Kudshim. There's certain types of Korbanos that's a Kudshe Kudshim. Only Kohanim can eat from those Korbanos. Or it's a Korbanola. However, then there's something called Kudshe Kalim. Like Bechor, Pesach. Those are called Kudshe Kalim. And the Balim, the owners of the Korban, get to eat it. But you can't just eat it anywhere you want. You have to eat it within a certain precinct relative to where the Makam of the Mikdash is, Makam of the Mishkan. And so, there's a Mishnah in Zvachim, which says, when the Mishkan was in the Midbar, the precincts were the following. And when it was in Gilgal, the precincts were the following. And when it was in Shiloh, these were the precincts where you could eat the Kudshe Kalim. And in Givon and in Nov, also, these were the precincts. The Mishnah was put down into writing how many years ago? 1,800 years ago. Shiloh was destroyed 1,100 years before the Mishnah was written. And it was in function for 69 years from before it was destroyed. When did it start functioning? In the time of Yoshua ben Nun. Why is this interesting? You know, one time I had a student here at Aish Torah. We had a whole discussion about Torah Shabbal Peh. And he says, yeah, Rabbi, but can you show me Torah Shabbal Peh in action way back in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu? So I said to him, Moshe Rabbeinu I can't do, but would Yoshua ben Nun be good enough for you? The Mishnah says as follows, that in Shiloh, where you could eat the Kodshei Kalim was, here's the Mishkan, right? And then the Mishkan is on a hill. And around the hill, there are mountains. Okay? Now, comes the Mishnah and says, you can eat Kodshei Kalim in Shiloh in an area called Bechol Haroeh. What is Bechol Haroeh? Bechol Haroeh means where you can see the Mishkan. Anywhere on these hills, you take your Kodshei Kalim after you've been makriv in the Mizbeach, and you take it in your picnic basket, go sit on the hills with your family, and have your Kodshei Kalim. As long as you can visually have visual contact with the Mishkan, you're cool, you're good to go. But beyond these hills, you no longer have any visual contact. The year is 1924. A Danish archaeological expedition was surveying the entire area of Shiloh. It was the summer, and very often members of the expedition needed stitches on their feet. Why? Because they were wearing sandalim. Why were they wearing sandalim? Because it was the summer. I mean, you're crying out loud. Who's going to wear boots in the summer? Well, they needed to, because their feet were being punctured by pottery shards all over the fields. And they took these pottery shards and they actually started to date the pottery shards. Not dating the way you were thinking, but dating to try to ascertain what is the age, how old are these pottery shards. That's a cheap shot, sorry about that. Now, so therefore, what was the age? So the age, they say, it falls out basically to the Tkufa, to the period of the Shoftim. That's the Tkufa of Shiloh, when the Mishkan was in Shiloh. And there are hundreds of thousands of pottery shards all over the place. They actually made a map of where these pottery shards were found. And then the map, they wrote about it in one of their essays, in one of their reports, but no one knows where the map went. 17 years ago, the map resurfaced. A fellow from a town named Ely, not far from Shiloh, by the name of Zev Ehrlich, found the map in the Rockefeller Museum right here in East Jerusalem. It was whatever. He found it. And funny thing is that when he took a look at the map, they mapped out where the pottery shards, the extent of the pottery shards. Well, where were the pottery shards? All over Bechol Haroeh, wherever you walk, even today. I warn you, don't go with sandalim in the summer over here. Wear boots or good shoes. I'm telling you, your feet will be punctured and you'll need stitches. Okay? But outside of the Bechol Haroeh zone, there were very, very few shards. Why would these shards be there? Because you took your Kodshei Kalim, which were cooked in a Klei Cheres, and the Klei Cheres became Kodesh, and you ate your Kodshei Kalim on the picnic with your family on the hill where you're in visual contact with the Mishkan, and then you have this wonderful pottery. What are you going to do with it? You scratch your head and you say, hey, maybe we can have Cheerios and milk in it in the morning. So then your wife says, what, are you crazy? It's fleshik. Okay, maybe I can have something par. You can't. Why? Because it's kachim. And you can't use a clay cheres that was kachim for chulin. What do you do with it? You break it, you smash it. Ein lo tikun, there's nothing you could do with this pot rather than smash it, which was standard operating procedure for kalim that were kadshe kalim. You take it and you squish it into the ground. Finished. Isn't that fascinating? Here is a halacha in the Mishnah in Zvachim that was recorded 1,800 years ago, that was preserving a halacha that we didn't need for 1,100 years. Why do I need to know this halacha? I don't need to know this halacha. We're not going back to Shiloh. I mean, Baruch Hashem, there's a Yishuv in Shiloh. And Baruch Hashem, I think they have a shul that they built in made it look like the Mishkan. It's very nice. We're not going to rebuild the Mishkan. We're not going to be makriv korbanos. We're not going to be eating kosher kalim ever again in Shiloh. I think that I can say that categorically. So why do I need this halacha? Now, I don't know if the intention of Rabbi Yehuda Anasi was for this particular class to write the halacha in there, but you know something? It's rather profound. I think you'll agree with me. You want to see Torah Shabbal Peh in action. To the very, 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 very beginning of the time of Yeshua ben Nun, to the beginning of the Torah Shabbal Peh in action? Wow. Take a look at that. Rabbi Rosen, I understand that we've reached our limit. Am I correct? Yeah? Okay, are you guys okay? You copacetic? You want to keep going? Okay. I'm going to share one more with you. Okay, there are three more, but only one of them is really, two of them. One of them is, halacha is very organic. You know, we have an esrog, we have a mezuzah, we have tefillin. We see it in action. It's not just some dry, abstract information sitting on a university library staff waiting for a doctoral postdoc, candidate writing some obtuse dissertation in order to access the information. It's alive. We live it, we breathe it, we see it. You see the tefillin your grandfather wore, he saw the tefillin his grandfather wore, etc., etc. The sukkah you lived in, the arba minos you shook, etc., etc. The second thing is that what I'm going to share with you is that, so that's I don't know, I'll call it Torah Chaim. It's alive, it's organic. The next point is, up until now we've been speaking about the methodology of the Masorah. But this point is about the integrity of the Baalei HaMasorah. There's a fascinating story about Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. They were brothers-in-law, they were chavrusas, and they were sparring partners in halacha. And when Reish Lakish was nifter, Rabbi Yochanan was found walking around town distraught and in grief and crying. So they found an amazing, amazing Rav to be his chavrusa, his new chavrusa, to hopefully console him. 3 weeks later, he's wandering the town again, despondent. And they approached him and said, Rabbi Yochanan, why are you despondent? You have such an incredible new chavrusa to take the place of Reish Lakish. He said, yes, it's true. He's a wonderful, amazing Talmid Chacham, tremendous stature. However, when I bring a point of halacha, you don't understand. This Rav that you brought me to Mer Chavrusa, he brings me 24 rayas why I'm right. But when I learned with Reish Lakish, he would bring me 24 rayas why I was wrong. And I knew that if I could sustain all 24 of his attacks on me, and I could rebut them, then I knew, Baruch Hashem, I'm speaking the emes. This is the halacha la'misai. But if I could endure only 23, but I would succumb to the 24th argument, I would also say, Baruch Hashem, I'm not manchin to Am Yisrael, a halacha that's not nachal, it's not true. I'll leave it to emes. I don't need a yes man, I need someone to challenge me. The Rabbanan and Chazal were not in it to get their names up in neon lights. They were here for truth. The United States of America has how many people? 330 million people. How many political parties are there in America? 2. England. How many people live in England?
About 72 million.
72 million. How many political parties?
7.
Thank you very much. Italy has 90 million people. There are 8 political parties. The state of Israel has basically 7.5, 8 million people. How many political parties are there? Over 30. We're going to have an election in 66 days. Do you know how many socialist parties there are? 4. Why? You think you're a socialist? You're not a socialist. I'm a socialist. You think you're, each one is out because Jews, we want MS. We're crazy about MS. I think it's true. Chazal say this is about MS, and we're going to go to the end till we get to the MS because that's what it's all about. Now, that is the nature of Chazal. The nature of Chazal is not to get their names in neon lights. Their integrity was MS. I think that's a very, very important point. Now, I want to leave you with one last point. Rabbi Rosen. Okay? One last point. Now, I'm assuming you had a class about national revelation. And this point is going to actually impact on national revelation as well. The year is 2001. The year is 2001. Anybody who feels that they need to leave, I don't want to hold you back. The year is 2001. The place is Los Angeles. Who said it's in Los Angeles? Los Angeles. 2001, Los Angeles, the largest conservative synagogue in Los Angeles. It was Pesach, the first day of Pesach. First day of Pesach, the rabbi is Rabbi David Wolpe, perhaps the star conservative rabbi in North America. And Rabbi Wolpe begins his sermon on the first day of Pesach in Los Angeles in the synagogue, and the first sentence that comes out of his mouth is splashed on the headlines of the Los Angeles Times the next day. Second day of Yom Tov. Can you imagine that? A rabbi having his sermon on the front, actually it's the front page of the religion section, but okay, it's pretty good. And what was the first sentence? There were 2,000 people in synagogue that day. They had just finished their Pesach Seder, the first night Pesach Seder, and they were preparing for the second night's Pesach Seder. Rabbi Wolpe gets up and he says as follows. Archaeologists are in agreement, complete consensus, that the Jews were never in Egypt. We did not build the pyramids. About that he's correct. There were no plagues. We didn't cross the Red Sea. We didn't stand at Sinai. We didn't wander the desert for 40 years. And we didn't conquer the land of Canaan. It's not true. Archaeologists have not concluded that. They do not have complete consensus about this matter, and they're all over the map when it comes to these things. Rabbi Spiro and myself wrote a series of articles that's on Aish.com and other places where we addressed Rabbi Wolpe, and we addressed him in other forums in North America as well. And it is very, very clear that archaeologists are very, very far from any kind of consensus that sounds anything like that. But what was the reaction of the people in synagogue that morning? A significant percentage of them stood up and applauded. Yay, Rabbi, you're courageous. Tell it like it is. Don't be afraid. Another significant percentage of the congregants that morning stood up and voted with their feet. And they crossed the street and went to more traditional shuls. I think that speaks for itself. But there was another significant percentage. And how we know about this is because there were students that came to Aish Torah from this synagogue who were there that morning in the next 2 to 3 years. That's how we know the story. What was the next response? The third response from another significant percentage of people was, if it is not true, then why are we eating this cardboard? And you might be laughing, but a significant percentage of those who responded that way did not observe the second Passover Seder that they were planning on having. How important is the Pesach Seder? That's how important it is. It is the lifeline of the Jewish people. And if it didn't happen, we'll hemorrhage and die. If there's no Pesach Seder, there's no transmission. Because what's the purpose of a Pesach Seder? Not to commemorate an event that happened 3,300 years ago. Come on, let's grow up. We're creating an organic link to the historical event of Yetzias Mitzrayim and Ma'amad Har Sinai. And why am I bringing this up? Because what applies to Yetzias Mitzrayim applies to Ma'amad Har Sinai. What applies to Ma'amad Har Sinai applies to Torah Sheba'al Peh. The whole thing is really all together. They occurred within a space of 7 weeks of each other. And so, how can we know that when we're sitting at a Pesach Seder that we're receiving information from 3,300 years ago intact, with integrity? Same question as Torah Sheba'al Peh, except without the Sanhedrin. Now we're going down through a family, right? So I'd like to explain it this way, and this is where we're going to conclude. Well, let's say we're at Yetzias Mitzrayim and Ma'amad Har Sinai is 3,300 years, and here we are today, and we're going to create a chain, and that chain has links. And each link is one Pesach Seder, not a Pesach Seder, but transmission. A transmission of what happened in Yetzias Mitzrayim and Ma'amad Har Sinai to the next generation. How many links need there be in this chain to connect us today all the way back to Yetzias Mitzrayim and Ma'amad Har Sinai? Have Omer. Some people will say thousands. Some will say hundreds. Well, let's actually take a look. Imagine we have a 70-year-old grandfather having a Seder with his 13-year-old grandson. Age difference, please? 57 years. So each link is 57 years. So now, how many links do we need? Well, let's divide 3,300 by 57. And the answer is, drum roll, approximately 58. Approximately 50, let's call it 60. That's interesting. 60 links, that's not as much as we would have thought. That's not too bad. However, when we look at these 60 links, we have to appreciate a couple of points. Point number one, the grandparent and the grandchild might be together multiple times. 5 times, 10 times. That reinforces the link. Makes it a very strong link. Not only that, the link could be longer. The grandparent could live longer. And so we need less links than 57. But let's stick with 57 for the time being. Not 58, rather. Okay? But the truth of the matter is that we're not just talking about one chain with 60 reinforced links. Because when we came out of Mitzrayim, there were 600,000 families. And each one of these families represents a chain of its own, with its own links. And those splinter off in time and create their other chains, and there were millions as we go through the flow and sequence of history. Be that as it may, let's talk about hundreds of thousands just for the sake of the argument and the discussion. Now, what's the benefit, therefore, that I have hundreds of thousands of chains? Well, the benefit is actually rather fascinating. In research, in sociology research and other research, there's something called cross-sectional validation. What is cross-sectional validation? Well, Steven Spielberg funded not a study, but he's funded tens of thousands of videos and interviews of Holocaust survivors. And when you watch those interviews, right, you'll see people of different complexions, coming from different parts of Europe, speaking different languages, who experienced what they experienced in all different places. This one was in Hungary, this one's Romania, this one is Poland, this one is Italy, this one is Greece, wherever it was, all over the map there. They're speaking different languages. However, they all have the same basic elements to the story. There was a ghetto, and then there was a transport, and there was a selection, and there were work camps, and death marches, gas chambers, crematoria. Basic elements existed in all the stories, no matter who was telling it, from what location in Europe, and what language that they spoke. The fact that they experienced these things in different locations became evident that they were telling the same story from these common elements. That's called cross-sectional validation. However, when it comes to time, we're looking at, let's say, hundreds of thousands of these chains, and then what we're going to do is we're going to identify a point in time. I don't know, 1,000 years ago, right? And we're going to look at families in 5 or 6 or 10 different locations throughout the world 1,000 years ago. What did your grandfather tell you at the Seder night of Yetzias Mitzrayim? And what did yours? And what did yours? They all speak in different languages. And some might have more details and some might have less details, but they all have the same basic elements. There was a shiabud, and there was Avaros Parach, and then there were Makos, and then there was Yetzias Mitzrayim, and a Kriyas Yamsuf. Oh my goodness, right? The same story, and the frogs, and the right. Everyone has the frogs, at the Seder table, right? You have to. That's a doraisa. Now, therefore, when you do this, it's called a cross-sectional validation. The fact that I have multiple hundreds of thousands of multiple chains, I'm able to do a cross-sectional validation. Do the same elements exist? However, you might have a kasha for me. And that kasha will be a very good kasha, but it's an essential kasha to bring us to the point really home, which is, hey, wait a minute. The Seder, the Haggadah, it's been published. We've been reading that Haggadah now for the past 1,800 years. That's true. But what about before 1,800 years? How many years have we been transmitting the Haggadah Baal Peh? Completely Baal Peh, including the Torah Baal Peh. Because Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, at the time of Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, not only was the Mishnah formatted and put down into writing, and the Brises and the Toseftas, but the Haggadah also. The truth of the matter is, the Haggadah is Perak, Arvei Pesachim, and Pesachim, the 10th Perak of Pesachim. That is the Haggadah, basically. Right? It's been formatted and writing ever since then. But up until then, it was completely Baal Peh. And that's what we want to focus on. What about that time? How many years are we talking about? If I can find the eraser. Right? How many years are we actually talking about? It's not 3,300 years. 3,300 minus 1,800 is 1,500. It was 1,500 years of only oral transmission. And if we divide 57 into 1,500, how many links are we looking at? We're looking at approximately 26. Let's call it 30. Why not? Let's be generous. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of chains that are only 25 to 30 links long, where each link is reinforced probably multiple times over, where we have cross-sectional validation capacity. That reflects a methodology which is extremely well thought out and implemented, which can carry volumes of information with high degrees of integrity and be susceptible to the least amount of corruption, meaning corrupting the information. My friends, when we look at all of the points that we're discussing tonight, we discussed broken telephone, standardization, machlokes, the MMT document, Shiloh. We discussed Torah's time, that it's organic, the mitzvos. We discussed the integrity of the transmitters, who were the people of Chazal, the integrity of them, they themselves. And now we finish off by talking about this methodology of the transmission, where what's being transmitted is Halacha L'Moshe Sinai, the Yigul Midos, and the Klolei Halacha of Shas, the 106. Those are the main body. We're not talking about enormous volumes of information, and the Haggadah itself. We're talking about very manageable information. The methodology enables the transmission of this information with an extremely high degree of integrity in order to ensure a very minimal damage and corrosion and corruption of the information. Ashrecha Yisrael, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave to us this methodology. And we can look today and say the Torah Shabbal Peh that we have today is what we started with way back when on Har Sinai. Ashreichem Yisrael. I thank you very much. If you have any questions.
Alright guys, thank you very much. Been 10 next week, 2 weeks from now, February 16th. We'll start at 8:30. Please stop and give your name in for